What if everything you thought about wealth, success, and true value was wrong? Imagine being raised with everything money could buy, only to learn that the most important things in life can't be bought. Stick around to find out how one millionaire used a blind date to teach his daughters a life-changing lesson. Picture this: a millionaire, a father of twin girls, decides to pull off an unexpected twist in his life. This wasn't about flashy cars, private jets, or extravagant vacations to exclusive locations. No, this time, it was about a date. But not just any date, this was a blind date. And to make it even more intriguing, he arranged it with a black woman. That might sound like the beginning of a typical love story, but hold on, there's a plot twist that'll knock you off your feet. This millionaire, let's call him Thomas, decided to take a radically different approach to something that many would consider simple: dating. But here's where the twist comes in. Thomas, who had built his wealth through years of hard work and strategic investments, made a bold decision. Instead of showing up as the high-profile businessman with a ton of cash, fancy cars, and expensive suits, he chose to pretend to be broke. Yes, you heard that right. A millionaire who could have easily flaunted his wealth in front of his date, chose to downplay it all. But why would he do such a thing? Well, this wasn't about testing a woman's genuine interest or seeing how someone would react to his money. It wasn't about playing games or tricking anyone. Thomas's decision had a deeper purpose. You see, Thomas had two young twin girls, Sophia and Lily, who were growing up in a life surrounded by wealth. They lived in a beautiful mansion, drove luxury cars, and vacationed in the world's most expensive destinations. To anyone on the outside, it looked like they had it all. But Thomas, as a concerned father, was starting to notice something troubling. His daughters were beginning to form judgments based on wealth. They thought that money and status were the most important things in life, and this worried him deeply. Thomas didn't want his daughters to grow up with the belief that money defined a person's value or character. He didn't want them to think that a person's race, background, or financial status made them less worthy of respect or kindness. He understood that, as privileged individuals, they were likely to experience a different world than most people, and he wanted to show them how crucial it was to see people for who they truly were, not for what they had. So, he came up with a plan, a way to challenge their views and open their eyes to the realities of life beyond their bubble. The blind date was the perfect setup. He wanted to show them that wealth wasn't everything, and that people should be valued for their character, not their bank accounts. In his mind, it wasn't enough to simply tell them these lessons. They needed to experience it firsthand. They needed to witness how someone could be treated differently simply because of their economic status and how they should never judge a book by its cover. On the night of the date, Thomas dressed down in simple clothes. Gone were the tailored suits and designer watches. Instead, he wore a modest shirt and jeans, even driving an old car that didn't scream wealth. His daughters had no idea what he was up to. When they arrived at the restaurant, they were shocked. It wasn't the usual five-star luxury spot they were accustomed to, it was a humble, casual place. They were confused, but curious. And then, they met Jasmine. She was confident, graceful, and easy to talk to, with a warmth that immediately put everyone at ease. She was a black woman, full of stories and experiences, and she exuded a charisma that was impossible to ignore. Sophia and Lily, despite their initial hesitation, found themselves drawn to her. Laughing at her jokes, learning about her passions, and realizing that this wasn't about money or status. Jasmine wasn't just someone there to entertain them, she was an individual with depth, personality, and a perspective that made them see the world differently. What Thomas hadn't told his daughters yet was that the whole night had been a setup, and the most important lesson was yet to come. After dinner, he finally revealed the truth. "I'm not broke," he said with a sly grin. "I just wanted to see how people are treated when they don't have money. And I wanted you both to experience that firsthand." The twins were stunned. Their dad, the wealthy millionaire, had deliberately kept his financial status a secret to teach them a lesson about humility, respect, and understanding. That night, as they left the restaurant, Sophia and Lily were deep in thought. They realized something profound: people should be judged by their character, not their financial situation. Jasmine wasn't just an incredible woman because of her kindness, but also because she had proven that true wealth wasn't about the things you could buy. It was about the richness of your heart, your mind, and your soul. Thomas's lesson was clear: no matter how much money you have, no matter where you come from, the value of a person lies within them. The wealth of kindness, respect, and empathy is something no amount of money can buy. And as his daughters processed this lesson, Thomas knew that the bond they shared with others would be built on these principles, not on material wealth. Now, you might be wondering, why would someone who has everything, wealth, success, the life many dream of, want to fake being broke? It's a question that seems strange at first, right? Why would a millionaire, who could easily show off his riches, choose to downplay his success? The answer lies in his deep love and concern for his twin daughters, Sophia and Lily. Thomas, the millionaire in this story, had always provided his daughters with the best of everything. From designer clothes to vacations in exclusive resorts and the finest education money could buy, they had it all. Growing up, the twins lived in a mansion that could rival any celebrity's home, with rooms full of expensive toys, art, and gadgets. They had access to everything they could ever need or want, and their world was filled with luxury and high-status living. But there was something Thomas began to worry about as the girls got older. He feared they were becoming too accustomed to this lavish lifestyle. They started viewing the world through a lens of wealth and privilege, and he could see how that was shaping their perceptions of others. Thomas had noticed something concerning. Sophia and Lily were beginning to take wealth for granted. They had friends whose families also lived in high-end neighborhoods, whose parents owned fancy cars, and who traveled in private jets. The world they knew was a bubble, one where everyone around them seemed to have just as much money, if not more. And while Thomas was proud to provide his daughters with everything they could desire, he realized that this lifestyle had come with a subtle risk. His girls were growing up with the belief that money, success, and appearance were what defined a person. But Thomas didn't want that for his daughters. He didn't want them to judge people based on their wealth, race, or appearance. He wanted them to understand the deeper qualities that made someone valuable, qualities like kindness, empathy, and respect for others. It was clear to him that if his girls were going to be grounded in reality and not just the fantasy world of money, he had to show them firsthand that there was more to life than wealth. So, what better way to teach his daughters this lesson than by staging a situation where the values of kindness and equality were put to the test? Instead of talking to them about how to treat people with respect and not judge others based on their financial status, Thomas decided to take matters into his own hands and put them in a situation where they could experience it for themselves. He wanted to create an environment where his daughters could see someone, not for what they had, but for who they were as a person. This is where the blind date idea came in. Thomas carefully orchestrated the evening. He planned everything down to the smallest detail, knowing that this would be a moment he couldn't undo. Instead of showing up in his usual expensive suit, with all the luxuries that came with his status, he decided to go completely against type. He dressed down, opting for simple jeans and a t-shirt. He left his expensive watch at home and wore a modest jacket. Even his car, one of his prized possessions, was replaced with something much more modest. He chose an old, reliable car that blended in with the crowd, one that wouldn't turn heads. The goal was clear: he wanted to be seen as just another man on a date, not the wealthy businessman he was. He also selected a modest, down-to-earth restaurant, nothing extravagant or glamorous. He wanted a setting that felt casual, familiar, and comfortable. The evening would be as far removed from the world his daughters were used to as possible. The blind date, in a sense, would be a real-world test of how his daughters would react to someone who wasn't defined by wealth or status. The woman he had chosen for the date, Jasmine, was someone he admired for her character, intelligence, and warm personality. It wasn't her race or background that mattered to Thomas, it was who she was as a person. She was perfect for what he had in mind. The plan wasn't about tricking anyone or setting up some dramatic moment. It was about creating an experience that would shift the way his daughters thought about people. The message he wanted to send was simple: the most important thing in life isn't money, it's people. And that night, he hoped Sophia and Lily would come to understand that true worth comes from the heart and character, not the number of zeros in a bank account. So, with all the careful thought and planning that had gone into it, Thomas was ready. The stage was set, the plan was in motion, and as the evening unfolded, he was about to give his daughters a lesson they would never forget. Thomas had arranged every single detail for the evening, but what his twin daughters, Sophia and Lily, didn't know was that they were about to experience something that would forever change the way they viewed the world. The night of the blind date had finally arrived, and there was a palpable sense of excitement mixed with confusion in the air. They'd only heard snippets of their father's plans, but he'd kept much of it a mystery. The girls knew their dad had a date that evening, but who the woman was, and why it was such a big deal, remained a mystery. As they made their way to the restaurant, Sophia and Lily were a bit nervous. The idea of going to a restaurant that was completely different from the fancy ones they were accustomed to was enough to unsettle them. They were used to glitzy, high-end spots with impeccable service, the kind of places where the menu seemed more like a work of art than a list of food choices. But tonight, their dad had promised them something different. When they pulled up to the restaurant, their expectations were immediately challenged. The building was small, unassuming, and far from what they were used to. There were no valet services or golden chandeliers. The sign above the door was simple, and there wasn't a red carpet in sight. In fact, the atmosphere was much more casual than they had ever imagined. Sophia and Lily exchanged glances, their eyes full of confusion. They had expected something extravagant, something that screamed wealth and opulence. But this place, this restaurant, looked like any other ordinary spot. As they entered, the low hum of chatter and the smell of home-style cooking filled the air. The ambience was warm and inviting, but not in the polished, upscale way they were accustomed to. There were no waiters wearing tuxedos or a crowd of high-society patrons. Instead, the place felt comfortable, relaxed, and real, a sharp contrast to the polished world of privilege they lived in. The twins felt out of place, like fish out of water, unsure of what to expect next. And then, they saw her. Jasmine. She was seated at a table, looking effortlessly elegant in a simple but stylish dress. Her presence filled the room. There was something magnetic about her. Something that immediately caught the girls' attention. When she smiled at them, it wasn't the kind of smile that was reserved for cameras or red carpet events. It was warm, genuine, and filled with life. She stood up to greet them, her energy and confidence instantly putting them at ease. There was a calmness about her, but also a sense of adventure in her eyes that made Sophia and Lily want to know more. "Hi, I'm Jasmine. It's so nice to meet you," she said, her voice full of warmth. Her greeting was so natural, so full of kindness, that it was almost impossible not to feel drawn to her. The twins were caught off guard. Jasmine wasn't just a beautiful woman, she had an undeniable charm. As the night went on, they found themselves laughing at her stories, completely absorbed in her infectious energy. She had a way of making them forget that they were in an unfamiliar setting. Instead of focusing on what the place lacked, they began to appreciate the atmosphere, the people, and the genuine connection they were building. But while the twins slowly warmed up to Jasmine, there was something they didn't know. Their dad, Thomas, had been orchestrating this entire evening. The way he was dressed, the modest car he'd driven, the casual restaurant, all of it had been carefully planned as part of a bigger lesson. He was trying to show his daughters that appearances could be deceiving, and that a person's true worth had nothing to do with the things they owned or the status they held. Jasmine wasn't here because of her wealth or her background. She was here because of her personality, her kindness, and her ability to connect with people on a deeper level. The twins hadn't yet realized that their father was playing a role in all of this. He was pretending to be just another guy on a date, a man without the wealth that usually defined him. He had hoped that by witnessing this real interaction, they would begin to understand that people should be valued not for the things they had, but for who they truly were inside. The laughter, the conversation, and the connection they were having with Jasmine were all part of his plan to teach them something that wealth couldn't buy: authenticity and humility. As the evening wore on, Sophia and Lily began to notice something else too. Jasmine wasn't just a woman with a pretty face. She had a story to tell, a story filled with experiences that shaped who she was. She didn't need designer clothes or fancy cars to impress anyone. Her words, her experiences, and her character spoke for themselves. Slowly, the twins began to realize that this was a woman who had something far more valuable than material possessions. She had depth, wisdom, and a perspective that was completely different from what they were used to. And that's when it started to click. The lesson their father had planned was slowly unfolding before their eyes. As the evening progressed, the conversation flowed effortlessly. Jasmine shared stories about her childhood, her career, and the challenges she had overcome in life. Her anecdotes were filled with humor, wisdom, and an openness that made everyone at the table feel at ease. Sophia and Lily, initially unsure and a little out of their element, began to relax. They laughed at Jasmine's stories, intrigued by her ability to light up a room with just her presence. There was no pretension, no need for showmanship. Jasmine was simply being herself, and that authenticity was what made her so captivating. As the dinner carried on, the twins found themselves more and more comfortable around her. At first, they had seen Jasmine through the lens of someone who didn't belong to their world, someone whose life seemed different because of her background, race, and what they assumed to be her financial situation. But now, something was changing. They stopped focusing on what they thought separated them from her, and began to recognize the things they shared: laughter, common interests, and the unmistakable connection that happens when two people meet on equal footing. Jasmine's warmth, her relatability, and the way she effortlessly shared parts of her life made it clear: she wasn't here to impress anyone, and neither was anyone expecting her to. She didn't need the trappings of wealth to prove her worth. Her personality, her values, and her experiences were enough. Slowly but surely, Sophia and Lily stopped evaluating Jasmine through the usual filters, the way they often judged people based on their appearance or assumed wealth. Instead, they began to appreciate the real person sitting across from them. And that's when Thomas, who had been observing his daughters closely, realized that his plan was working. Thomas noticed how his daughters were no longer hung up on the surface. They weren't focusing on Jasmine's background, her race, or her financial situation. They were just getting to know her as a person. He could see that his girls were starting to shift in their thinking. They weren't looking at her as different anymore. They saw her as funny, kind, and genuine, qualities that mattered far more than the trappings of wealth. They were beginning to understand the lesson that he had hoped to teach them. This wasn't about how much money you had, or the car you drove, or the kind of clothes you wore. What mattered most was who you were, how you treated others, and the depth of the connection you could create. But just as the night seemed to be reaching its perfect conclusion, Thomas knew it was time. He had carefully orchestrated every part of the evening, but now, he needed to make the lesson crystal clear. It was time to reveal the truth. He leaned back in his chair, cleared his throat, and flashed a playful grin at his daughters. Sophia and Lily looked at him, puzzled. They were clearly enjoying the evening, but they were still a little unsure about what was going on. "All right, girls," Thomas said with a chuckle. "It's time to spill the beans." His twin daughters froze. Their eyes widened, their brows furrowed, and they waited for what he was about to say. "I'm not broke," Thomas said, his smile widening as he watched the confusion spread across their faces. "I just wanted you to see how people are treated when they don't have money. And more importantly, how valuable it is to focus on who they are, not what they have." The revelation hit like a bombshell. Sophia and Lily sat there in stunned silence. They had no idea what their father was talking about. How could he not be broke? Everything about this evening had seemed ordinary, even simple. The casual restaurant, the modest car, and Thomas himself, who had played the role of someone who had far less than he actually did. The girls exchanged a glance, but still, the truth hadn't fully sunk in. Thomas watched them carefully. He had intentionally staged this night to make them realize something important about the world, the power of empathy, kindness, and seeing people for who they truly were. He didn't want them to grow up believing that money was the only thing that mattered in relationships or that anyone's worth could be measured by their financial status. The entire evening had been a carefully orchestrated lesson, and he knew that the only way for them to truly understand it was by experiencing it themselves. The girls, now processing what their father had just revealed, sat quietly. They were shocked, but as the realization began to dawn on them, something clicked. This wasn't just a date, this was a teaching moment that would stay with them for the rest of their lives. Thomas smiled softly, watching his daughters reflect on the evening. He knew that this night, with its unexpected twist, had shown them more than they could have learned from any lecture. They had seen firsthand how important it was to look beyond wealth, race, and appearance, and to value people for who they were on the inside. It was a lesson that no amount of money could have taught them. And that, he hoped, would be something they would carry with them forever. The revelation hit Sophia and Lily hard. Their minds, which had been shaped by a lifetime of luxury, status, and the belief that wealth was the key to everything, were suddenly shaken. They sat there in stunned silence for a moment, processing what their father had just revealed. The weight of it all began to sink in. They had been raised in a world where money was the defining factor, where respect, admiration, and even friendships were often dictated by the size of your bank account or the brand of your clothes. The girls had always assumed that money opened doors to every opportunity and that those who didn't have it were somehow less deserving. But what they had experienced that evening was about to change everything. In Jasmine, they had seen someone completely different from anyone they'd met before. She wasn't someone who flaunted wealth or sought attention. She wasn't concerned with appearances or what she owned. Instead, she radiated a kind of warmth that made her stand out in a way that money never could. As they reflected on the evening, the twins slowly began to understand what their father had been trying to teach them. Jasmine wasn't defined by her background, her race, or the material things she had or didn't have. She was a person of value in ways that went far beyond possessions. She had shown them what true worth looked like, not in the things you could buy, but in who you were as a person. For the first time, Sophia and Lily understood that it wasn't about how much you had, but about who you were. The laughter they had shared with Jasmine wasn't because of the fancy car she drove or the expensive clothes she wore. It was because of the way she made them feel, seen, heard, and respected. The realization was so powerful that it almost left them speechless. The walls they had built around themselves, based on what people owned or the social circles they moved in, were suddenly irrelevant. All that mattered was kindness, honesty, and treating others as equals. As they walked out of the restaurant, the cool night air hit their faces, but neither of them felt the coldness that had once defined their world. Instead, there was a sense of warmth in the air, a new kind of warmth that had nothing to do with wealth. As they got into the car, they turned to their father, eager to understand more about what they had just experienced. They needed to process everything they had seen, but their minds were already racing with questions. "Why didn't you tell us?" Sophia asked, her voice soft but filled with curiosity. "Why did you pretend to be someone you're not?" Thomas smiled gently at his daughters. "I did it to show you something that's far more important than money. I wanted you to experience it yourself, to see how people are treated when they don't have wealth and to understand how much more there is to a person than what they own." Lily, always the more reflective of the two, spoke up next. "I never really thought about it like that. I guess I always assumed that if you had money, people would like you more. But Jasmine, she was different. She didn't need all of that to be amazing. That's right, Thomas said, nodding. Jasmine has qualities that money can't buy: kindness, intelligence, humor, and a depth of character that's rare to find. Those are the things that make people truly valuable. As the car drove through the quiet streets, Sophia and Lily processed their father's words. They were starting to see the world through a completely new lens. They had always been told about the importance of being kind, respectful, and considerate, but it wasn't until that evening that they truly understood what those things meant in practice. Jasmine had shown them that what truly mattered was not what you wore or the money in your bank account, but the way you made people feel, the way you treated them, and the authenticity you brought into every interaction. For the first time in a long while, the twins felt a sense of clarity. They realized that their father's wealth had always been part of their world, but it wasn't the center of it. It was just one aspect of life, but not the defining one. Their hearts were what mattered most, and it wasn't just about their hearts, but how they saw others, too. They needed to look beyond the surface, to appreciate the richness of a person's soul, and to treat everyone as equals, no matter their race, financial status, or background. As they arrived home, the girls were quiet, but it wasn't an uncomfortable silence. It was the kind of silence that comes when something profound has just been realized. They knew their dad's plan had worked. Not only had it shifted the way they viewed others, but it had also opened their eyes to the real value of people. In the end, it wasn't the things they owned or the world they lived in that mattered, it was the love, authenticity, and kindness they showed to others. And with that, they knew their father had given them a gift far more precious than money: the ability to see people for who they truly were, through the lens of their hearts. If you enjoyed this story and the powerful lesson it shared, make sure to hit that like button. And if you haven't already, don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss an inspiring story like this one. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.